Why Solomon's kingdom was doomed, the untold story of his downfall. History remembers King Solomon as the wisest ruler ever to walk the earth, a man whose very name became a proverb for judgment, justice, and discernment. His reign was the golden age of Israel, literally, for silver was said to be as common as stones in the streets of Jerusalem. He commanded vast armies, ruled a united kingdom, and presided over a court so dazzling that even the Queen of Sheba, hardened by the splendor of her own empire, left breathless, her spirit spent in the face of his opulence. Yet as with all golden ages, the radiance blinded the eyes of those who lived within it. Beneath the gilded facade lay deep fissures, hairline fractures in the heart of Israel's destiny. In those cracks, unseen by the crowd and ignored by the throne, the seeds of Solomon's downfall took root, seeds that would one day split the kingdom in two and scatter its people like dust before the wind. This is not the Sunday school tale dressed in polite morals and soft edges. This is the raw, unvarnished truth. Solomon's wisdom, brilliant though it was, could not save him. And therein lies the most sobering lesson for us today. No human brilliance, no political genius, no towering wealth can outmaneuver the quiet, patient corrosion of the soul. If you want to journey deeper into the untold story, into the secrets history tried to polish away, stay with me. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you won't miss the revelations still to come. The secret political deals that undermined his throne. The first shadows over Solomon's throne were not cast by the spears of invading armies, nor by the banners of hostile nations marching on Jerusalem's gates. They were cast by his own hand, by decisions made in the glow of candlelit chambers, and in the quiet calculation of a mind too confident in its own brilliance. In an age when kingdoms rose and fell on the fragile thread of alliances, Solomon played the game of thrones with unmatched skill. His foreign policy was a tapestry woven with gold and silk marriages to the daughters of kings from Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and far beyond. Each union was not a matter of the heart, but of strategy, not a covenant of love, but a contract of convenience. To the seasoned diplomats of the ancient Near East, it was masterful statecraft, the kind of genius that secured borders without drawing a sword. But to the prophets of Israel, the guardians of covenantal purity, it was the first betrayal, a fracture in the moral spine of the monarchy. For in those royal processions, behind the veils and jewels of foreign brides, came something more dangerous than armies' foreign gods. They did not arrive with fanfare, but in silence, concealed within the ornate chests of dowries, carved in gold, bronze, and stone. They came accompanied by priests and attendants, who whispered prayers in tongues strange to the ears of Jerusalem, who kindled fires before unseen deities, and who, in time, built shrines on the very hills that surrounded the holy city. At first, it was nothing more than a gesture of tolerance, a small concession to foreign queens so they might feel at home. A shrine here, a sacred grove there. A little incense burned for a god whose name the elders of Israel could not pronounce. But in matters of worship, compromise is never static, it grows. Soon the city of David, once the singular heart of covenantal devotion to the Lord, pulsed with competing altars, each sending up its own smoke into the heavens, each carrying a different song into the air. And here was the bitter paradox. The man who built the temple of the Lord, a house of unmatched splendor, became the same man who allowed incense to rise to Molech and Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess of the Sidonians, on the high places just beyond the city walls. The king who had once walked in the fear of God now presided over a divided spiritual kingdom. The God who had granted him wisdom beyond measure watched as Solomon's own cunning became the instrument of his undoing. Every marriage secured a treaty, every treaty secured a trade route, and every trade route brought prosperity. But each alliance also weakened something invisible, yet far more vital: Solomon's moral and spiritual authority. The more he succeeded in the eyes of the world, the more the foundation of his throne, built on covenantal obedience, began to erode. It was the oldest lesson in the rise and fall of empires. The greater the reach of a kingdom, the greater its exposure to compromise. Yet to the people, the decline was invisible. They still saw the gilded throne, the cedar-paneled halls fragrant with imported incense, the court glittering with diplomats and dignitaries from the ends of the earth. They still heard the music of harps drifting over the palace walls and the voice of their king pronouncing judgments with unmatched eloquence. Outwardly, the kingdom had never been stronger. But history is not shaped only by what is seen. It is also shaped and often undone by what is unseen. And what the people could not see was that the covenantal heartbeat of the monarchy had begun to falter. It is tempting, even for us today, to believe that such compromises are harmless, that politics and principle can be neatly separated, that the machinery of governance can run on pragmatic deals without moral cost. It is a seductive lie because it allows a leader to justify the erosion of his own integrity in the name of stability, peace, or prosperity. But history tells another story, one as old as civilization itself. No kingdom collapses overnight. The walls do not suddenly give way. The gates are not instantly breached. The unraveling begins in silence, in the dim light of private chambers, in the handshake deals and whispered promises that trade away truth for advantage. By the time the banners fall, the real defeat has already taken place, long before in the quiet decay of the soul. Solomon's downfall began not with rebellion in the streets, but with the subtle redefinition of what it meant to be king in Israel. In the beginning, the king was meant to be the servant of the covenant, ruling in the fear of the Lord, bound by the same laws the shepherd in the fields. But in the latter days of Solomon's reign, the covenant served the king, or rather, it was made to bend to his ambitions. The law became pliable. The line between diplomacy and disobedience blurred. In choosing to bind himself to foreign powers through marriage, he also bound himself to their bonds, their customs, and their values. The throne of Israel was no longer just the seat of David's lineage. It was now a table where the Lord's covenant sat alongside idols, each given a place of honor. And perhaps this is the most sobering truth for any age, ancient or modern. When the sacred is placed on equal footing with the profane, it will not be long before the sacred is swallowed whole. Compromise in matters of the soul is like a hairline crack in stone, imperceptible at first, but under the relentless pressure of time and circumstance, it will widen until the entire structure collapses. In the eyes of the world, Solomon was still the wisest of men, the master of statecraft, the ruler of an empire whose influence stretched from the Euphrates to Egypt. But wisdom without obedience becomes arrogance, and power without restraint becomes a snare. The foreign altars were not just symbols of religious pluralism, they were the visible markers of an internal shift in the heart of the king. Each altar stood as a silent witness to a transaction won where eternal truth was traded for temporary advantage. The tragedy of Solomon is not simply that he sinned, but that he did so in the name of wisdom, believing himself too shrewd to be corrupted by the very practices he tolerated. In his mind, the stability of the kingdom justified the concessions. Yet the kingdom's stability was already unraveling, thread by thread, in ways he could not or would not see. By the time the consequences arrived in the next generation, the seeds of division had already taken root. The alliances that once protected Israel became the channels through which its identity was diluted. The prosperity that had filled the treasuries masked the poverty of its soul. And the throne, once a symbol of unity under God, became the epicenter of a slow, steady fracture that would split the nation in two. So the lesson stands, stark and immovable. The greatest threats to a kingdom or to a nation rarely begin at its borders. They begin at its heart. When truth is traded for expediency, when faith is bartered for influence, and when the sacred is compromised in the name of the practical. The banners will one day fall, but only because the foundations have already rotted away in the quiet, unseen spaces where leaders make their most consequential choices. And perhaps, if we are honest, the story of Solomon's political deals is not a distant, ancient cautionary tale. It is a mirror held up to every generation that believes it can navigate the corridors of power without the anchor of principle, that thinks it can play with the fire of compromise and never be burned. It is a reminder that wisdom is not merely the ability to see the path ahead, it is the humility to walk it in obedience, even when that path demands the costliest of sacrifices. For Solomon, the cost was the very thing he sought to preserve, the unity, strength, and divine favor of his kingdom. And for us, reading his story millennia later, the cost is the loss of our illusions that greatness can be built on compromise, and that a throne once cracked can stand forever. The Temple of God, or the beginning of national bankruptcy. Of all the marvels of Solomon's reign, none shone brighter in the annals of history than the Temple of the Lord, a masterpiece of architecture and faith, a wonder of the ancient world. Its very description in Scripture reads like poetry etched in stone and bathed in light. Walls paneled with cedar from the forests of Lebanon, overlaid with sheets of pure gold. Its inner sanctum adorned with precious stones that caught the torchlight like stars scattered across heaven's floor. It was, to the eye of the faithful, the physical embodiment of Israel's covenant with God, a house where the divine presence itself would dwell. For generations to come, it would be the pride of the nation and the envy of kings. But such glory, as is the way of all glory built by human hands, came at a price far greater than gold. And that price was not counted merely in talents of silver or bars of bronze, but in the labor, the sweat, and the very lifeblood of the people. The building of the temple, followed swiftly by the construction of Solomon's royal palace, was an undertaking so vast that it consumed the kingdom's energies for decades. Tens of thousands of laborers were conscripted men taken from their fields, their vineyards, their workshops placed into forced rotations of toil. Some labored in the quarries, splitting massive stones under a punishing sun, their hands blistered and raw. Others bent their backs beneath the weight of cedar beams floated down from Tyre, their shoulders aching under burdens that smelled of salt and sea. These men did not labor for weeks, but for years, their absence from home measured not in days but in seasons, their sons often joining them before the fathers returned. The financial weight was no less crushing. Taxes swelled to unprecedented levels, not just to fund the temple, but also the fortifications of distant cities, the building of military outposts, and the construction of palaces that testified to Solomon's growing power. At first, the people bore this burden willingly, proud to be part of a legacy that would stand for centuries. To be able to say, "I helped build the house of the Lord," was an honor that eclipsed the strain on one's body or the loss of a year's harvest. In those early years, faith and national pride dulled the edge of sacrifice. But time has a way of eroding enthusiasm when hardship becomes a way of life. Seasons passed, and not every year was generous with its rains. Crops failed, flocks thinned. Yet still the king's collectors came, their ledgers inked with numbers that had no regard for drought or famine. Merchants, once flush with the profits of expanded trade, now found themselves caught between the tolls imposed by foreign traders and the unyielding demands of the crown. What Solomon had promised as prosperity became a quiet oppression for those who tilled the soil and guarded the gates. The glory of the temple was a distant thing to the farmer watching his grain carted away to meet royal quotas, to the blacksmith whose best iron was claimed for palace gates instead of village plows. In Solomon's eyes, the temple was the pinnacle of his reign, the crowning jewel of his service to God, a monument to the faithfulness of Israel and the greatness of its king. But in economic terms, it was the point of no return. This treasury, once overflowing with tribute from conquered lands and gifts from admiring allies, now leaned heavily upon the productivity of common households. Tribute from abroad could no longer keep pace with the ambitions of the court. And when the foundation of a kingdom's wealth shifts from external gain to internal extraction, history knows well what follows: resentment, fatigue, and a slow-burning disillusionment that eats at the unity of the realm. A subtle yet dangerous transformation had taken place. The temple was no longer simply a sanctuary of worship, a sacred meeting place between heaven and earth. It had become a political symbol, a testament not only to God's glory, but to Solomon's power. It was an ever-hungry monument, demanding constant feeding, maintenance, priests, sacrifices, festivals, all sustained by the sweat of a people whose daily struggles grew heavier as the years went on. To the worshiper standing in its courts, it might still have been a holy place, but to the laborer who had hauled stone for months on end, or to the mother who had watched her sons leave for years of compulsory service, it had begun to resemble something else entirely: the gilded face of their own exhaustion. Here lies the tragic irony. that history never tires of repeating. The very thing built to secure a people's identity became, for many, the emblem of their oppression. What should have been a unifying force slowly turned into a dividing line, a reminder of how far the lives of the common people were from the splendor of the royal court. The fault line between king and people widened even as the walls of Jerusalem reached higher and higher, as though the city were building fortifications against its own heart. From a theological lens, the danger was even greater. For when a holy object becomes a symbol of political authority rather than divine covenant, the line between worship of God and worship of power blurs. The temple, though dedicated to the Lord, stood as a constant reminder that the king's word had become the law, even in matters of faith. And where the king's glory competes with God's, one always begins to overshadow the other. Solomon may not have intended for this to happen. Perhaps in his mind, the beauty of the temple would forever draw the people back to God. Perhaps he believed that the grandeur of its courts would inspire faith in the generations to come. But what he failed to see or refused to acknowledge was that beauty funded by oppression cannot long inspire. It can only embitter. A monument can be both awe-inspiring and suffocating, both a sanctuary and a symbol of subjugation, depending on which side of the tax ledger you stand. For Americans today, the parallel is uncomfortably clear. We too live in an age of monumental ambitions, where leaders speak of legacies and great works, where national projects are justified in the name of unity, progress, or security. But history whispers a warning through the dust of Jerusalem's stones. When the cost of grandeur is paid disproportionately by those who have the least, the result is not lasting unity, but a widening divide. And when sacred institutions are built upon the backs of the weary, they risk becoming monuments to human pride rather than to divine glory. The story of Solomon's temple is not just about an ancient building. It is about the choices leaders make when the hunger for legacy overtakes the responsibility to protect the well-being of their people. It is about the temptation to believe that beauty and splendor can justify any cost. And it is about the truth often learned too late that the very projects meant to secure a kingdom's future can become the forces that undermine it. In the end, the temple stood for centuries. Its stones witnessed prayers, sacrifice, and the songs of countless generations. But those same stones also bore silent witnesses to the day the kingdom split, to the day the united voice of Israel became two rival nations. The temple survived that day, but the unity it was meant to symbolize did not. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. A monument can stand long after the spirit that built it has been lost. Wisdom turned blind. The fatal flaws Solomon refused to see. Perhaps the most haunting truth about Solomon's life is not that he lacked wisdom, but that he possessed it in such abundance and yet allowed it to slip through his fingers like sand. In the pages of Proverbs, many of which bear his name, we find a treasury of insight on justice, humility, discipline, and the fear of the Lord. They are not the words of a detached philosopher, but of a man who once knew in his very bones the weight of these truths. Yet as the years lengthened and the seasons of his reign passed, the sage became the sovereign, and the sovereign slowly insulated himself from the sharp edge of his own counsel. The very wisdom that had been his greatest gift became a mirror in which he saw not the will of God, but the reflection of his own brilliance. In the early days of his reign, Solomon was a man on his knees before God. His prayer was not for riches, not for the death of his enemies, not for the spoils of conquest, but for wisdom to govern his people well. This humility was his crown before any crown of gold touched his head. It was this posture of surrender that drew the favor of heaven and brought him the clarity to judge between truth and deception, between justice and oppression. But prosperity has always been a subtle sedative, and power is an intoxicating wine that, when sipped daily, dulls even the sharpest conscience. Over time, the young king who trembled at the enormity of his task became a ruler confident in his ability to navigate any storm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his trust shifted from the God who had appointed him to the intellect that had carried him thus far. The prophets, those weathered, unyielding voices who once stood before him and spoke as the mouthpieces of God, faded into the background of his court. Their warnings about idolatry were met with polite nods, but no action. Their calls for justice for the oppressed were delegated to ministers, bureaucrats, and court officials. The urgency of moral leadership gave way to the machinery of political administration. Justice became a matter of policy rather than principle. Righteousness became an ornament rather than a foundation. Solomon's wisdom, which had once been a living stream, fresh and flowing from its divine source, hardened into a monument, beautiful to behold, but lifeless, a shrine to his own reputation rather than a channel for God's truth. Philosophers across the ages have observed that the gravest blindness is often born of too much light. It is the blindness of one who stands so close to his own brilliance that the shadows in the corners go unnoticed. Solomon's mind became a palace of mirrors, intricate, dazzling, and endlessly reflective, so that everywhere he turned, he saw only confirmation of his own greatness. When one becomes both the subject and the measure of wisdom, the hard truths have no place to enter. In that palace of mirrors, no prophet's rebuke could find purchase. No reminder of humility could penetrate. He no longer discerned between counsel that came from God and counsel that came from the flattery of men. It is here that we see the fatal flaw. Wisdom without humility becomes arrogance, and knowledge without obedience becomes folly. Solomon did not fall because he forgot what was right. He fell because he chose to ignore it. He knew the commands against idolatry. He knew the covenantal responsibilities of the king. He knew that justice was not a gift from the throne, but a duty before God. And yet, in the quiet calculations of his later years, he weighed those truths against the political convenience of foreign alliances, the ease of delegation, the comfort of avoiding conflict, and he decided again and again to look away. In neglecting the hard truths, Solomon allowed injustice to take root in the soil of his kingdom. In tolerating injustice, he undermined the very covenant that gave him the right to sit upon David's throne. His wisdom was no shield against corruption, for wisdom unused is no different from ignorance. The tragedy was not that he failed to understand, but that he refused to act. We like to think that wisdom is a safeguard, that if we know the right thing, we will inevitably do it. But Solomon's story stands as a sharp warning that knowledge and action are not the same. A man can see the cliff's edge and still walk over it. A nation can read the lessons of history and still repeat them. Knowing is not enough. The courage to obey is what separates those who endure from those who fall. For Americans today, the image is unsettlingly familiar. We live in an age overflowing with information, surrounded by advisors, experts, and endless access to knowledge. But wisdom is not the accumulation of facts. It is the willingness to act rightly even when it costs us. Solomon's life reminds us that the possession of wisdom is meaningless if it is divorced from the humility to submit it to something higher than ourselves. In the end, the wisest man in history stumbled not because he could not see, but because he would not look where it mattered most. The throne he sat upon was not shaken by foreign armies first, but by the erosion of his own moral foundation. And when the foundation cracks, the fall is inevitable, no matter how strong the walls, no matter how high the towers. Solomon's palace of mirrors still stands in the human heart. It is the temptation to measure our choices by our own brilliance, to listen only to voices that confirm what we already believe, to turn from the discomfort of truth toward the comfort of self-assurance. It is the danger of mistaking the possession of wisdom for the practice of it. And it is a danger that no one, not even the wisest, can escape without deliberate humility. The lesson is as urgent now as it was in the courts of ancient Jerusalem. Wisdom unused becomes a liability, and unchallenged self-confidence becomes a silent enemy. To know and not to do is to stand at the edge of ruin, believing oneself immune to the very laws that govern all men. Solomon's greatness lay in his God-given insight. His downfall lay in his refusal to keep bending that insight before the one who gave it. The end came not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow dimming of the light, a gradual fading of that first, desperate prayer for guidance. And when the light was gone, the shadows that had been gathering in the corners of his kingdom rose to fill the void. From glory to rebellion, how his own people sparked the collapse. When Solomon closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind a kingdom that, to the casual observer, was the very image of strength and splendor. The walls of Jerusalem gleamed in the sun, its storerooms were full, and its reputation reached the ears of kings in distant lands. It was, on the surface, the crowning achievement of Israel's monarchy, a tapestry of power, prosperity, and prestige, woven together by decades of diplomacy and monumental works. But beneath the surface, the threads were fraying. The realm he bequeathed to his son, Rehoboam, was not a unified nation, but a masterpiece resting upon a fault line, a powder keg awaiting a spark. For decades, the weight of heavy taxation and forced labor had been carried on the backs of ordinary men and women. Farmers who had once rejoiced in the kingdom's victories now saw their harvest vanish into royal storehouses. Craftsmen who had once built homes for their neighbors now labored on fortresses and palaces they would never enter. Inequality grew like a shadow over the land. The splendor of the court, the gold, the banquets, the choirs, had become an echo of a distant dream for those who measured their days in toil and scarcity. The palace in Jerusalem might as well have been another world. So when Solomon was gone and his son ascended the throne, the people saw an opportunity, not for rebellion, but for relief. They came to Rehoboam with a simple plea: ease the burdens your father laid upon us. It was not an ultimatum, not yet. It was a request born from years of endurance. But Rehoboam, untempered by his father's wisdom, and perhaps intoxicated by the intoxicating illusion of royal invincibility, chose defiance. My father made your yoke heavy, he told him. I will make it heavier. In that moment, words became a blade, severing the already frayed cord that held the kingdom together. The rebellion that erupted was not stirred by foreign enemies at the gates. It was the work of Israel's own tribes. Brothers turned away from brothers, declaring with ancient bitterness, "What portion have we in David? To your tents, O Israel." With those words, the northern tribes seceded, and the unity that David had fought for, bled for, prayed for, was shattered in an instant. The monarchy that had once been the pride of a united people became a tale of two kingdoms, each weaker than the whole they had once been. The causes of this fracture were not sudden. They lay embedded in the very policies that had once made Solomon's reign shine. The strategies that expanded the kingdom's borders also deepened the divisions between its people. The monuments that proclaimed God's glory also stood as symbols of royal excess to the weary laborer. And the wisdom that once drew the nations to Jerusalem somehow failed to keep the nation itself from splintering. The seeds of division were sown in the same soil as the seeds of prosperity. This is the quiet cruelty of history. The instruments of greatness often become the instruments of decline. The grand vision that rallies a people in the beginning and, if unchecked, become the burden that breaks them in the end. Solomon's alliances brought peace, but they also brought compromise. His building projects brought pride, but they also brought exhaustion. His wealth inspired awe abroad, but resentment at home. By the time the crown passed to Rehoboam, the kingdom's unity was a brittle illusion. The fall of Solomon's kingdom is not merely an episode in the annals of ancient history. It is a parable written in letters large enough for every nation to read. It speaks to the danger of assuming that threats always come from without, that the true enemies of a nation are the armies beyond its borders. More often than not, the fatal blow is struck from within, not by invasion but by corrosion. Nations are not only lost in war, they are lost in the slow decay of trust, in the quiet abandonment of justice, in the widening gap between ruler and ruled. It warns that wisdom, when divorced from humility, curdles into arrogance. It warns that prosperity, when stripped of justice, becomes a gilded cage for the many and a throne of fragility for the few. And it reminds us that the collapse of a great people does not always arrive with the roar of cannon or the clash of swords. It can come with a sigh, a turning away, a silent refusal to follow. In the end, Solomon's reign stands as both the zenith and the hinge point of Israel's monarchy. Never again would the kingdom be so rich, so influential, so envied by its neighbors. But never again would it be whole. His kingdom was not destroyed by a single act of treachery or a decisive battle. It was undone by 1,000 small compromises. Each one on its own may have seemed harmless. A little more tax here, a small concession there, a tolerance of injustice for the sake of expedience. But together they eroded the sacred bond between king, people, and God. And perhaps the most sobering truth is this: the downfall of great nations often begins at the very moment they believe themselves most secure. It is in that moment that vigilance sleeps, that leaders mistake applause for approval, and that pride takes root like a hidden weed beneath the marble floors of power. Seeds of decline are rarely sown in the hour of crisis. They are planted in the days of triumph, when no one imagines they will ever bear bitter fruit. The story of Solomon's fall is not simply the story of a man or a monarchy. It is the story of human nature under the weight of power. It is the story of how blessings can become burdens, how wisdom can become blindness, and how glory can mask decay until it is too late. It is a mirror for every people who believe themselves invincible, a warning etched in the memory of history. No throne, no flag, no empire is beyond the reach of ruin.